Here's a brain teaser for you. If sex is biological and gender is a social construct, then how the fuck is gender dysphoria a biological condition? So Blair White and ContraPoints, both YouTubers I like, debated about stuff. A lot of stuff. However, this question about gender dysphoria occurred to me while watching the debate. Because Contra and many others, including Bill Nye of all people,
my vagina has its own voice.
What are you doing in my swamp?
Have repeated this claim, that there is this clear distinction between the concepts of sex and gender. Sex is biological, and gender is social. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, this creates the idea that gender has nothing to do with biology, thus is entirely psychological, which leads to the conundrum I opened with. You see, there's lots of evidence that gender dysphoria is an innate biological, neurological condition that you're born with. So how the fuck can you be born with a condition about a social, psychological concept? The truth is that this is not true. Or rather, it is not universally true. Cause all the
flaccid, effeminate, soft social sciences
like to make this clear distinction, but the medical field doesn't. You know, the community that classifies and treats people with gender dysphoria? The one that's
firm, robust, masculine hard sciences
supposed to be based on empirical science? So what is the medical definition of gender? Fortunately, it's easy to find. It's right there, in the DSM. Gender is used to denote the public lived role as boy or girl, man or woman. But, in contrast to certain social constructionist theories, biological factors are seen as contributing, in interaction with social and psychological factors, to gender development. There's 3 things of note here. 1. Biology influences gender. 2. Look at that nice little fuck you to the social sciences. Yeah, let's just look at it, yeah.
The flaccid, effeminate.
And 3. Boy, girl, man, woman.
Oh shit.
There's only 2 genders. But wait, what about gender identity?
Let's check out what the
DSM-5
says.
Gender identity, a category of social identity and refers to an individual's identification as male, female, or occasionally some category other than male or female. Ah, there you go. A nice little label for you to use. Gender identity is a social construct, while gender is a mix. So why the fuck is this important? I'm sure some of you are thinking, I'm making some sort of irrelevant wordplay definitions argument that distracts from the real issues.
Okay, first of all, this is a semantic argument, which are the worst kind of argument.
No.
This distinction is a real issue, because right now, various social groups are lobbying the APA, trying to pressure them into removing the mental illness label from gender dysphoria. And this isn't because the condition doesn't fit our current definition of a mental illness, it's because of feels. And in case you're confused, mental illness doesn't mean the illness is made up or psychological. People suffer from chronic depression because of a chemical imbalance in their brain. So despite the counterintuitive name, mental illness doesn't mean. So the problem is, by attempting to cement this idea that gender is entirely social into the minds of the masses, they're implying that everything under the label of transgender is social, except it's not. Gender dysphoria is biological. Wait, you thought transgender only meant people that want to transition from male to female or vice versa? Trans, like transition. So people with gender dysphoria, right?
Nope.
Transgender is an incredibly broad label that everyone has a somewhat different definition for. The APA That is the American Psychiatric Association, the people that write the DSM, say transgender refers to the broad spectrum of individuals who transiently or permanently identify with a gender different from their gender at birth. So that includes people with gender dysphoria, gender queer, gender nonconformist, and all those various lists of genders that straight white manly men like me don't care about.
How tough are you?
How tough am I?
I shun preconceived notions of masculinity in order to express my true feelings.
Listen, kid. I think you'd be more comfortable over at that place.
Weenie Hut Juniors? Are you saying I belong at Weenie Hut Juniors?
Oh no, sorry. I was actually pointing to the place next to it.
Super Weenie Hut Juniors?
And that's the problem. We have evidence that gender dysphoria is a biological, neurological condition. We don't yet have evidence that any of this other stuff has any sort of biological basis. In fact, the trans community completely dodges that point by creating their own distinction between sex and gender. So they don't need a biological basis, which is fine. My purpose here is not to say that all those gender categories don't exist. My purpose is to say that gender dysphoria should not be in the same category as any of this other stuff. Gender dysphoria has biological evidence. This stuff doesn't. Gender dysphoria is a disorder. This stuff isn't. It's not a medical disorder. Having a biological medical disorder lumped in with all this other stuff is creating too much fucking confusion for everyone. That's right, I said disorder. Because if you are born with a condition that you have no control over, that makes you feel like you were born in the wrong body, or the wrong sex, or the wrong gender, and this feeling is so strong, it causes you untold amounts of stress, pain, and depression, that's a disorder. Mechanically, that's obviously not supposed to be the way the brain works. Because if it was, humans would have never made it past prehistoric times.
But Sitch, why is it so important that it retains the mental illness label? That just makes people feel bad.
It's important because it changes the way the medical community treats the issue. As Blair herself said,
Because it seems that the activism should be focused on acceptance for trans people and not on saying, oh, I wish that we could just get rid of this.
Why can't we do both, though? That's like saying that you can't simultaneously fight for people to be kind to autistic people and also look for a cure. How about we do both? That'd be great. That would be great, because actually insisting on this, just be kind and just accept people and don't worry about it, it's all normal, everything's fine, that actually leads to political correctness, which leads to there not being any research into a cure, which exacerbates all the suffering.
Any reason at all to think that there's a drug that will work for this? For something as complicated and integral to identity as gender identity, is there any reason to think that a drug is going to alter that?
and I'm sorry, Contra, but I can't agree with your argument here. That just because we currently don't have such a pill, or maybe even close to some magic pill, that doesn't mean we as a society should deny the medical reality and not continue research in that area. You're arguing for secondary reasons here, not primary reasons. You're arguing against the medical illness label, not necessarily because on its face it shouldn't be labeled as such, but because of a perceived secondary effect of that. That for some people, that can justify being bigoted, or can make individuals feel bad, which I understand. I get the dog whistle concern here. However, that's not going to help medical treatment in the long run.
But Fitch, there's people who want to transition but don't have the dysphoria.
And that's why it's so important to separate gender dysphoria from all this other stuff. Because all the research on transsexuals, and for the record I'm going to start using the term transsexual to refer to individuals who were born with a biological condition to distance the term from transgender, All the research has been on people who have dysphoria, because the idea that there are even people who believe they were born the wrong sex or wrong gender but don't have dysphoria is relatively new. So it hasn't been studied. So we don't even know if it's a biological condition or only a psychological one. Unfortunately, we don't yet have a biological medical test to determine whether someone is suffering from gender dysphoria. We don't yet have a biological way of measuring what someone's innate gender or gender identity is, or whatever the fuck you want to call it. We have evidence that it is indeed innate, but not a clear, put you in a scan, hey look, you've got gender dysphoria. That is, you have biological gender dysphoria, not a psychological issue that makes you think you're trans. Another reason why the distinction needs to be made so clear. People who have purely psychological reasons for wanting to be the opposite gender or another gender should be using biological hormones and physical surgery. Those options should only be for people that have a biological, neurological condition. People whose feelings towards their gender does not have the ability to be transient, to change.
But Sitch, it sounds like you're talking about trans regret. That's a tiny number of cases and a dog whistle for transphobia.
Shut your Supposedly, trans regret is not common. I say supposedly because I'm not interested in doing research into that at this moment, because it's not a direct correlation to what I'm talking about now. Regret could be very low now, but as Blair says herself,
This is a very new phenomenon. There are no long-term studies that show a person at 30, 40 years old who transitioned at 12, 13 years old and how their life ended up, because it just has never happened. This is very new.
Because until recently, the stigma against transsexual people was so high that it would be very uncommon for someone who only has a psychological complex to go through the transitioning process. However, because we're living in the enlightened future world of 2017,
We're going to build the wall.
society is becoming far more accepting of transsexuals, which is good and the way it should be. But it does also mean that it would be more likely for people who are only psychologically trans or gender non-conforming to be confused with people suffering from a biological, neurological condition.
You're very concerned about all these kids showing up because of this trendy idea of what it is to be trans. Why is that a concern if there are medical gatekeepers in place who are able to distinguish between people who are doing it as part of the trans?
And that's exactly the point. The DSM is supposed to act as a guidebook to help doctors make the distinction between someone who is actually suffering from gender dysphoria and someone who is biological versus psychological.
But Sitch, I just read the DSM's criteria of gender dysphoria, and there's nothing specifically in it about making this distinction between biological versus psychological.
Yes, and that's because psychiatry looks at stuff through primarily a biological lens. So they're operating from the place of, if you don't have a biological reason for something, then you don't have it. Combine that with the fact that this current societal focus on understanding transgender issues is new, and the DSM-5 was written before that, and this creates a problem. And since we don't yet know how to create a definitive biological test, we can only rely on self-reporting and observable behavior, which is why it's so problematic. Because doctors have to somehow navigate this complicated maze to figure out whether someone really is suffering from gender dysphoria, or gender non-conforming, or going through a phase, or genderqueer, or what the fuck ever else is out there. This is why transsexuals feel like they have to go through so many hoops, and all this recent transgender stuff is only making the issue more confusing for everyone. which means you're making it harder for doctors to figure this shit out, which means more hoops. Now, let me make myself clear. I am not blaming the transgender movement or even suggesting that it should go away because they're confusing the poor children. There is no hidden dog whistle in what I'm saying. I am only stating what is the reality of the situation. And unfortunately, because our society, until recently, has been very bigoted against individuals who don't fit in strict gender roles, the trans community is incredibly sensitive to anything that can even remotely be perceived as an attack. Which I understand. However, the problem is when people are undergoing rather intensive physical treatment for a condition, it is the medical community and even society's duty to make sure that individual really requires that treatment. And having medical treatments that were either overprescribed or turned out horrible have littered our history. From bloodletting to shock treatment to even staring at the sun for health reasons. And we can't forget about lobotomies. Even now, there are concerns about kids being overprescribed Adderall and Ritalin, which is basically speed, not to mention all the people addicted to painkillers. Now, perhaps I am sensitive about this because I am currently suffering from health issues, nothing related to the trans stuff, because I was prescribed medicine I didn't need, which has fucked up the way my body functions. And I almost had unnecessary surgery that would have made the problem 1,000 times worse. And this was all for a biological condition that is far, far less complicated than anything related to gender. And that's why it's important, although difficult, to put our emotions aside when dealing with these medical issues to avoid the medical pitfalls that we humans have fallen in time and time again. Or, feel free to take what I said as merely a dog whistle for transphobia because I'm actually a hateful bigot.
Even if you're not a transphobe, Sitch, you keep making this distinction between biological and psychological. Assuming doctors can even untangle these interrelated concepts, why should a person who only has gender dysphoria psychologically not be allowed to transition?
Because if your gender dysphoria is purely psychological, that means the gender dysphoria is a symptom of another problem. It's not the problem itself. Allow me to give you a very oversimplified example. Let's look at Game of Thrones. Cersei has stated on several occasions that she wishes she was born a male. And if, say, there was some magic potion in Game of Thrones that could change your sex, you better believe Cersei would drink it in a heartbeat. But the reason for this is not because she is suffering from gender dysphoria. It's not that she has some innate feeling of being born in the wrong body or wrong gender. The reason is because she exists in a world where her biological sex or gender limits her ability to seize power, her primary goal. So her complex for not being a male is secondary. It's a means to an end. The doctor evaluating whether someone has gender dysphoria needs to concentrate on making sure the underlying problem is that the person feels that they are born the wrong gender because they simply are. Something biologically innate. Not that they were born the wrong gender, because they developed a negative psychological complex about what it means to be their birth gender, or a negative psychological complex about a specific body part that just so happens to be a body part related to biological sex. Because an issue like that is transient and can be resolved through other means.
Fuck you, Sitch. That Game of Thrones example was crap. Real life is far more complicated.
Yes, real life is more complicated, so let me give you a more grounded example while simultaneously criticizing the DSM. So far I've been seemingly filleting the DSM, which maybe makes you think I believe the DSM is some holy book, the immutable word from God. It's not. It has some very serious flaws, in my opinion, One of those flaws exists in the criteria of gender dysphoria. Right now, an adolescent female could say be going through that awkward stage of puberty, where her chest starts blossoming. And if you happen to be a blessed young lady, or simply talk to someone about their experience, you will find that many of those individuals actually had a quite negative experience with it when they were young. Hilariously inappropriate visuals aside, one such story that has always stood out in my mind was when a friend told me about how she developed when she was 13, and how incredibly disturbing and sometimes scary for her it was to see grown men lusting sexually after her. And at least to me, it doesn't seem that out of the ordinary that someone in that position could develop a psychological complex about their breasts. And in today's confusing world, they could incorrectly rationalize that complex as meaning they have some gender-related issue. Possibly even gender dysphoria. And under the current DSM criteria, someone in that position could be diagnosed as having gender dysphoria. In fact, here's an article titled, "My Daughter's Not Transgender, She's a Tomboy." The article describes how because of all this confusion, this young 7-year-old girl who would be the pride of every feminist because she casually tosses aside traditional gender roles. She wears track pants and t-shirts, has short hair like Luke Skywalker, likes sports and playing with the boys. She is a strong, independent woman that needs no man. And yet, teacher after teacher, her pediatrician, adults who have known her for years, keep asking, "Are you sure you're not a boy?" Now, fortunately, this young girl has a strong sense of self, so she's able to vocalize that no, she is not a boy. She's a girl who just happens to like things that are typically associated with boys. This is happening in part because of this confusion of gender dysphoria being associated with transgender stuff. Because we don't have this clear distinction between transsexual and transgender. My fear is that we're not only confusing the fuck out of adults with the incorrect conflation of these terms, but also confusing kids who may simply be gender non-conforming, yet think they're transsexual. And as a last note, perhaps it's unfair for me to point this out, but I do find it somewhat ironic that the trans community is fighting against the idea of a strict binary view of male-female gender by advocating a strict binary view of sex and gender. What? Oh yeah. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel.